Hello, Harrison Wright here. Welcome to this live breakdown of our recruitment protocol, specifically for crypto startups. This presentation is entitled, How to Create A-Player Candidates That Are Otherwise Unrecruitable and Avoid Having to Hire B-Players, Building a House of Cards That Falls Apart in a Bear Market, or Burning All Your Runway Without Success. Some pretty bold claims here, I know, so I'm excited to dive in and show you how this is possible. Let's talk about who this is for. This presentation is for well-capitalized crypto and Web3 startups. When I say well-capitalized, you probably have some funding, usually seed, if not at least pre-seed. And you've got a vision, you know where you're going to have a need to build an exceptional team in coming months and years. Now, by the end of this presentation, you'll know 5 things. Number 1, why conventional hiring methods produce such mediocre results. Number 2, the 3 meta trends that have changed hiring forever, which these conventional hiring methods have not accounted for. Number 3, everyone loves to talk about finding candidates. I'm going to show you why this doesn't make any sense and what to do instead. Number 4, I'll show you a full breakdown of our blockchain recruiter protocol, which incidentally has a near 100% success rate. Finally, you will leave with a high-level framework of how to succeed at hiring in the information age. And if you stay till the end, I'm going to have a great giveaway for you as well, so don't miss out on that. So before we dive in, let's talk about what I like to call the slow-motion train wreck of mediocre hiring. People love to talk about the dangers of a bad hire. You can't stop hearing about that if you talk to recruiters. But you know what? The reality is much more insidious than that. Let's define an A-player. What is an A-player? Well, the specifics of what make an A-player are going to change depending on the role, the organization, and the specific context. But ultimately, the defining characteristic of an A-player is that they're force multipliers. They do more, they innovate more, they exercise autonomy to bring in new and better ways of doing things. Things often that you didn't even know that you needed. They free up time and energy for you to work on the business instead of in the business, to focus on strategy, on vision, on building. And even better, with their force multiplier effect, they also create a network effect that brings in other A-players and attracts them to your team. Essentially, when you have A-players, you worry less, you have to manage less, and you get more, often a lot more than you expected. So what happens if you don't hire A-players? What if you hire B and C players instead? Well, it's the opposite. Instead of being force multipliers, they sap your time and energy. They force you to spend your time working in the business instead of on the business. Your horizons get lowered. You're fighting in the day-to-day instead of focusing on the big picture. And their network effect creates and attracts other B and C players to the organization. And this then compounds. By the time you realize the problem you have, it's too late. The damage is already done. And we need to arrest this cycle. We need to arrest it as early as possible in the life cycle of your organization to give you maximum leverage to win this big race we're all engaged in. So let's talk about the 3 meta trends. The first meta trend is global competition. The TLDR here is that technology and globalization have conspired to make the entire world your competition. Think of a restaurant, your city's favorite pizza place, for example. They just need to be the best game in town. If they're the best pizza place in town, they're going to be busy. They're going to be highly successful. Almost all businesses used to work this way. But you're not playing that game. You need to be the best in the world. And to be the best in the world, you also need the best people in the world. And there's a compounding factor in the form of remote work. We love remote work. Everyone in crypto has always loved remote work. And it's great because it allows you access to a global pool of exceptional people. But guess what? Everyone else has the same advantage too. So not only are you competing against the world's best and brightest, you're competing with the world's best and brightest to hire the world's best and brightest for your team in order to achieve those goals. It's completely a double-edged sword. And these pressures and this market dynamism, it produces lower tenure, much higher hiring costs, and substantially reduces your window to achieve ROI on each hire compared to what industrial age organizations enjoyed. The stakes have never been higher. But this is only one head of our 3-headed hydra. Let's talk about the second meta trend. The end of information asymmetry. Well, what does that mean? Well, the internet and social media have effectively put an end to this, but conventional recruiting practice is still stuck in 1999. What does that look like? Well, I mentioned earlier about finding candidates and how people love to talk about that. Whenever they have a recruiting problem, they usually come back to this concept of, well, we can't find candidates. That's the problem they express. But let's dwell on this for a moment. In the age of LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, GitHub, anyone can find candidates online. It's a minimum wage activity. The problem is that they aren't listening. When information was scarce, candidates were receptive because recruiter calls were rare, novel, flattering. Today, the challenge isn't identifying them. The challenge is breaking through the noise. It's not about access anymore. It's about engagement. And so now instead of finding the right people, it's about competing to attract the best people. You compete on every level. You compete for their attention. You compete to get them to an interview. You compete on the offer. And even after you've won, even after they've joined your team, you compete to keep their attention. Even after the deal is sealed and for the lifetime of their time with your team. The recruiters don't stop coming just because they work for you now. And this is compounded by what people do when they have a recruiting bottleneck. The usual solutions to the lack of talent pipeline make things even worse. And it looks a little something like this. Hey, we can't find any candidates. We need to place more ads, hire more recruiters. Guess what? That just floods the market with even more undifferentiated noise and makes it even harder for your signal to be heard. In 1999, if you'd hired 4 different recruiters, what they would do is they'd hit up their respective Rolodexes, as they used to have, and source you a collection of great people from which to choose. And there usually would be little overlap because they all had their own individualized networks. If you do that today, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is those recruiters will all approach the same people who are easily identifiable online, hit them up with competing messages which might be completely different. They'll make you look bad, they'll tarnish your brand, and they'll make it even harder for you to actually get through to those people because all they're doing is adding to the noise. It's bad. So what's the final nail in the coffin? The final meta trend is what I like to call the performance differential. What is the performance differential? Well, this is all about where the leverage in an organization lies. And the TLDR here is that in the industrial age, say pre-internet, the leverage was mostly in the physical assets and capital investment of the respective company. Today, though, that leverage is in the intangibles. It's the creativity and innovation of your team. In other words, your leverage is created by your A players. And the barbell economy has certainly been a hot topic in recent years, but people usually talk about it in relation to personal income and life outcomes and equality and all those sorts of factors. But it also exists in relation to production and value. Now, back in around 2008 to 2012, my first industry I used to recruit in was industrial automation. I hired technical salespeople for big automation companies like Siemens, Rockwell, ABB. Now let's talk about that environment and how different it is from the environment you're in today. Was it important back then for companies to hire better salespeople? Did they produce better results? Sure, they definitely did. There's no question about it. But despite that, the reality is those companies could tick along perfectly well enough with mediocre sales teams. The vast majority of the company's value was derived from its physical assets, their products, their R&D, their capital equipment, their many locations, enormous productive capacity that they had. I mean, the capital requirements to participate in that industry was so intense, there could only be a handful of competitors. The entire industry was dominated by a few large players. And so even if the particular rep was terrible, a large percentage of customers would buy from them just because they would like that product the best or they trusted that brand the most, based on the entire history and existence of that company. So a great sales rep, they might improve results on their territory by maybe 40% over an average performer. That is significant, but it's not world-ending. It's a far cry from the differential you experience in your crypto team today. Let's talk about a BD person in a crypto-native environment. The best person you could hire isn't going to give you merely a 40% advantage over an average person. The difference could be so vast that it's essentially unmeasurable. We're talking orders of magnitude of difference, the difference between success and failure. And if you think about the traditional executive search industry, there's an interesting parallel there because in the industrial age economy, this enormous performance differential has always existed when it comes to executive hiring. But it wasn't really the case for what you might call the rank and file. Today, all of your early hires and key hires need to be treated the same way industrial age organizations treated hiring their next CEO. It's that important. And that's because your company now is your people and the ingenuity and the innovation that they deploy. It's not a coincidence that instead of talking about companies, now we tend to talk about teams. Can you imagine people talking about teams 20 years ago? No, they talked about companies. And I think that's very illustrative of the challenges that we face today. Now, a final compounding factor here is the recipe for success is far harder to pin down than it used to be. Back in the industrial age, you could learn your profession once. You could then execute the same playbook for the next 40 years for the rest of your career and be successful because things didn't change much. Today, we know that's not true. Markets change, success factors change from year to year or even month to month. And certainly in a startup and in crypto, everything is always a moving target on top of that. So you can't necessarily know that just because someone was successful in the past, they're going to continue to be successful in the future. That alone is not enough. And that's a big reason why this factor here, half of all hires fail. There's a large-scale observational study on this by Leadership IQ. You can look it up if you're curious. Only 19% of hires in this study, and this trend correlates with my experience, only 19% went on to achieve what they describe as unequivocal success. And a major factor for this is how hard it has become to predict future success solely on the basis of past success. But another compounding factor to this is, my experience, a lot of founders, a lot of managers, they give up on trying to improve their hiring because they don't even realize it's possible. They think, well, this guy was a rock star before and he failed for us. Well, maybe it's just random. Let's just throw numbers at it and see what we get. But it can be made predictable. It's just that the meta has dramatically been disrupted by the internet, by globalization, by technology, but conventional hiring practice hasn't adapted. That's the problem. And that's also the opportunity for you. So big picture, what does it take to succeed in this environment? We need to be able to recruit the unrecruitable. Let's talk about that. Don't find candidates, create them. If you think about this concept of finding candidates, and you think about the mechanics of supply and demand, the problem here is that, by definition, the people that are candidates are the people that are already open to hearing what you have to say. They're either looking for a job, or they're especially receptive to when you reach out to them. And the problem is everyone else is reaching out to them too. And by law of averages, the best people tend to be the ones that listen the least. Why? Because think of the person you know who's really the most dedicated, exceptional person you know. They tend to be self-sacrificing often. They think they're so focused on getting their work done, on doing an amazing job, they don't have time to think about, well, am I happy today? Or what am I feeling about my work situation? They're focused on getting things done. Now, is this a cast iron description of everyone who's great at what they do? No, of course not. But it's directionally accurate. It tends to be more true the better somebody is. The better they are at their work, the less they're going to listen to your recruiting outreach. So what is creating candidates? Well, think about those people who they're doing a great job today, but they're just not listening. They're not even they wouldn't even listen to, you would send them a great job pitch and they would ignore it. Are they a candidate? No. They're not a candidate because they haven't thrown their hat in the ring and they don't intend to. But that doesn't mean we can't recruit them. We just have to approach it from a totally different angle. Instead of hitting them with job pitches, we get them into a conversation where we create a sanctuary for them to discuss their vision for their career and their life, to explore the implications of anything that may be preventing them from realizing that vision in the future, or anything that's bothering them right now, but maybe they haven't made the time to think about. And we explore the gap between those two things, and if we can live in that gap. When this is done correctly, you'll hear people say things like, I never thought of it like that before, or yeah, I hadn't considered that, but maybe I do need to think about a change here. And what does that do for us? Number one, it breaks the mechanics of supply and demand, so we're not reliant on who's available in the market to recruit great people. Number two, it's a self-selecting group of people that tends to be much higher caliber than the average you would get through other means. And number three, it positions us to win the best people who are the most aligned, because before you even tell them about your job, we find out exactly what they care about on the deepest level. And we only recruit them if we can offer them what they really, really want. Finally, we create a much higher odds situation where instead of deciding on which of these 6 offers should I take, they have a binary choice. Do I stay where I am, or do I join these guys? And that de-risks your recruitment process substantially. And this is a much more powerful methodology, incidentally, even for recruiting people who are already candidates. They haven't experienced a recruiting process like this before. It's much more focused on them, and less about selling them a job. Now, once we've got this handled, we also want to be sure of creating differentiation at every step. Every part of the recruiting process should stand out. You know you're doing this correctly when you get people say, wow, I've never experienced a recruiting process like this before. And if you do this right, people will absolutely join you on the strength of your hiring process, because they see it as a reflection of what it's going to be like to work with you on everything else. You don't need to have a fancy brand name and the right logo and all the other advantages that someone like Polygon or Protocol Labs would have. You can win on process. Now, to realize success with our recruiting plan, we also need to optimize very explicitly for right curve outcomes. We'll kind of think we do that anyway, but it's not a nice to have to be in the top 20% in terms of hiring outcomes. It's mandatory. The barbell economy, the middle is just, it's almost worse to be in the middle than to fail outright, because you're just delaying and dragging out your eventual failure. If you have a middling team, a middling project now, what happens? You spend years struggling and stressing and trying to raise money and trying to deliver results, fighting fires, going gray young. And what do you get out of it? Nothing. You just become an unemployable ex-founder at the worst case scenario. That's not what we want. You'd have been better off not even doing anything at all. We have to be in the top 20%. And by doing so, we get less stress, less hassle, less gray hairs, more fun, and more results, and more money. That's where we need to be. Now, all of this is exceptionally difficult to pull off at scale. The good news is, this isn't the industrial age. We don't need to scale up a team of dozens or hundreds of people. We need a small, high leverage team of exceptional people. And if you do this right, you can get one person that produces the results of 5 ordinary people. That's what we want to aim at. And then we can afford to do this the right way every single time. And the final point here is that we need the incentive structure of the hiring process to be correct. So for example, if you're going to work with recruiters, you need to do so under a model that's going to enable them to deploy this process properly, not the old industrial age model of hiring competitive contingency recruiters that are incentivized to create more noise and invest less effort in producing these steps in the exact correct way. We need to incentivize candidate creation, differentiation, right curve outcomes, not resume flow and bums on seats. So without further ado, let's go to the breakdown of our recruitment protocol. You'll see 3 phases here. There's also a 4th phase. You see the thing at a high level here. I'm not going to detail the 4th phase in this breakdown, but we'll touch on it briefly at the end. Now, we've got discovery, candidate creation and talent go-to-market, and finally, performance-based hiring. All three layers are important. If we don't do discovery correctly, then everything else is going to be off and our results are going to be inconsistent and unpredictable. If we don't do correctly, then we're going to have some very expensive paperweights come out of the discovery process, and it's going to be wasted because we're not going to get the right caliber of people. And finally, if we don't implement performance-based hiring correctly, then you're going to risk mediocre hires slipping through the cracks, even if you do everything else correctly. But if we tie all these three together in combination, that's where nirvana lies. So let's look more closely at discovery. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. So discovery is a relatively linear sequence. The outcome of discovery is that we should know exactly the outcome of the hire we want to make, and we're going to know how to identify who that person is with a very high degree of confidence, and we're going to be able to position our opportunity in the marketplace effectively, which is what makes the candidate creation process work. So we start with organizational DNA. That's figuring out really what are our values and ethos and ways of working at a deep intrinsic level. This is not the, hey, this is our mission and values that we wrote on the wall so the VCs are impressed by us, but we don't actually live by. This is how we actually are. And the more we're honest with ourselves about who we are and how we work, the better the chance we have of attracting somebody who's going to fit within that. You don't want to be that team that oversells or missells and tries to create this perfect image. Someone comes in and they just don't gel with it. Every organization has flaws. It's about figuring out what are the flaws that we all can live with. What's absolutely critical is to define the performance objectives of the job. So usually when people are hiring, they'll throw together a job description that will say, oh, we need 3 to 5 years experience in this, with this tech stack. Your responsibilities will be all these obvious things that everyone knows are part of the job anyway. You could read 10 different job descriptions and you wouldn't really know what the job entails. You wouldn't have any understanding of what it would actually be like to work there or what success looks like. And where does 3 to 5 years of experience come from anyway, or 4 to 7? If you think about it, that actually incentivizes mediocrity. What makes somebody exceptional? I would argue it's largely about their ability to do more with less. So if you have somebody who has 2 years experience and somebody who has 7, and they produce equal results, the person with 2 years experience is actually much, much more capable. And their trajectory is much higher, which should be especially interesting to you as a startup leader, because the performance demands of your people will need to grow very quickly if things go right. And usually when people come up with these job descriptions, it's kind of like a wish list. It's not based on anything. How many people have you hired that didn't meet the job description at all, but excelled, or people that ticked every box and didn't perform? So when we define the performance objectives, we want to know the answer to the question, if you're meeting with this person a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or whatever time frame is important, and you say to them, hey, Dave, you've done an absolutely outstanding job. We couldn't have done it without you. I couldn't be happier. What exactly have they accomplished to give you that kind of reaction? The more tangible, the better. What is the outcome of the hire, the business objective that's been achieved? So instead of talking about writing code for X product, we'll talk about delivering a certain development deadline, building a certain product. Instead of talking about doing marketing and pay-per-click advertising, for example, we'll talk about user growth and TVL growth and other metrics that matter, and so on. You get the idea. Now, once we define those objectives, and the typical role should have about 3 to 5, we want to reverse engineer that to identify what does the workflow look like? What does the process they're going to need to follow in order to achieve those performance objectives? And the reason this is important is because there could be a certain objective that is achieved in completely radically different ways depending on the organization and the context and everything else. You might think, oh, this person's achieved a similar objective over here, so they must be great. And they might be great in that environment, but the way you require them to work, or the context requires them to approach it in a completely different way, and they can't do it, and so they fail. This is totally avoidable if you identify the workflow. Now, the degree to which you're able to do this specifically is going to depend on a lot of factors, including, have you had someone doing this job? Have you implemented and systematized this process already? Or are you going to be hiring someone to do this from scratch? If you have a very established team and process for a particular area, you can be very specific about this and you can find people who fit that mold. If you're hiring someone to do, say you're making your first marketing hire, for example, you probably don't know that process yet. But then part of the process is identifying what that process will be. So we already know from that piece of information already tells us if we want to have a high percentage chance that this person is going to succeed on the job, they're going to need to demonstrate evidence of being able to identify what the marketing strategy and process needs to look like and then implementing it in a similar context. Whereas if we're hiring the 5th identical position that's already well-worn, well, we need to evaluate their ability to follow that process. Now, once we've done that, we reverse engineer the workflow and objectives into identifying who that ideal person is. So the typical way of doing it is to create a list of skills and experience that you think correlates with success, The correct way to do it is to identify the objectives and reverse engineer that all the way backwards to identifying who is the right person going to be. And that's far more accurate. It's also far more compelling. So when we present this performance-based job description, aka a performance profile here, along with our value proposition, and we can talk in great depth about the performance spectrum indicators, i.e. what is the difference between good and great, great and exceptional in this context, that's really compelling, especially to the kinds of people who are you really want to hire. Because another characteristic of exceptional people is they might care about perks and money, yes, but moreover, they care about challenge and self-actualization and achievement. And if you can present your opportunity as a heroic mission and a set of obstacles they're going to need to overcome, that's going to really magnetically attract the right kinds of people. Another point I want to briefly touch on here about performance spectrum indicators is, most people can easily spot someone who's grossly incompetent or a superstar in their field, the top 1% or the bottom 20%. People don't struggle with that. What they struggle with is being able to tell the difference between someone who's good and someone who's great, or someone who's under average and someone who's good. The difference can be pretty subtle, and actually, that is going to be far more impactful for your organizational success than being able to spot the absolute superstars. Because most of the time, I'll be candid with you, you're not going to be able to hire the top 1% or the rock stars of the industry. You can repeatedly and reliably hire the top 20%, but that's a much more difficult thing to tell apart in an interview context. So we work on getting that exactly right, so you know exactly what that looks like before you interview anyone. What are those subtle differences? So the outcome of the discovery process is we create the performance profile, which is not a concept I invented, but it's there's a guy called Lou Adler who pioneered this concept. Highly recommend his work. But we have a performance profile, which is a performance-based job description, and we have a search timeline. So if you work with us on a search, for example, this is so systematized that we can tell you within a matter of typically 1 to 2 weeks, and often more accurately than that, exactly how long the entire process is going to take and which step we're going to be at each stage. Now, everyone involved in the search process is going to sign this off, so we're all on the same page from the outset, and we don't run into any problems later, and then we go to phase 2. And phase 2, this is the fun part, candidate creation and talent go-to-market. This first set of things here is all about identification. So we have our search thesis. Our search thesis is, who are these people going to be? Where are we going to find them? And how are we going to identify who's correct? Now we test that thesis we then go and identify our TAM. Now, if you have a commercial background, you probably know what a TAM is. It stands for Total Addressable Market. People usually use that in the context of sales and marketing, but it's absolutely applicable for your talent go-to-market as well. Now, you might have a narrow or a broad TAM, depending on the type of hiring requirement that you have. If, for example, you need a OG Solidity dev for your DeFi team, you're probably going to want to identify the entire TAM, because there's likely going to be only a few hundred people at max in the entire world who are the right fit for what you need. If you're hiring, say, someone to manage social media, potentially that could be tens of thousands of potential people. And which of those buckets your requirement falls into is going to define how you approach this. Because if you have a narrow TAM, you'll want to identify every single person. If you have a broad TAM, you need to think of factors that are going to refine it into a more manageable number. And what we should end up with is somewhere in the region of 150 strong prospects that we're going to target in our go-to-market campaign. Why 150? I can't actually tell you why the math breaks down this way. I can just tell you from many years of experience, it does. If you start with 150 strong prospects on paper and you execute this process, almost every time you will end up with a very successful hire and nothing will go wrong. I can't say every time because we're dealing with people and sometimes things go wrong. But overwhelmingly, that's what it takes to reach that consistent threshold of great success. Sometimes you might come up with a situation where, say, I've had searches like this. They're very niche. There's only 60 people who might be possible candidates. Well, if that's the case, it doesn't mean we can't succeed. Just know there's a much higher risk of failure. And we might get through the end of the campaign and find out that actually we can't hire any of these people right now for one reason or another. So either we need to change our standards until we end up with around 150, or we need to do something else. And so typically, if we don't have this, we go back and we recalculate our search thesis again, or we proceed forward with greatly increased risk. But let's say we do have our TAM identified and we've refined it to 150 or so. What do we do next? Well, we validate their contact information. We're not just going to be messaging them on LinkedIn the way, that would be the lazy way to do things. We want as many points of contact as we can find. We want phone numbers, emails, LinkedIn, Twitter, Telegram, etc. The linchpin is here where we deploy the candidate creation go-to-market campaign. And we want to do this in either a multi-channel, which is typical, or channel-validated way. What does channel-validated mean? Well, there's some leading-edge technology now that can tell you things like if someone answers their phone or not. Or you can identify, are they active or prolific on LinkedIn, on Twitter? Do they like Telegram? So One way to do this is multi-channel. So we create an outreach campaign that hits everyone across multiple channels. Or you can do it the channel validated way, where you figure out this person answers the phone, so we'll call them. This person sits on their email, so we'll email them. And we reach them in the way that they like to be reached and that they respond to. Either of these is great. The wrong way to do it is to just use one channel on whatever channel you prefer. If you do that, you're going to miss out on a great degree of results. And let me tell you something. This might change in future years, but right now, the secret weapon here is cold calling. Nobody likes to make cold calls anymore. The younger, under 30 generation of salespeople and recruiters haven't been raised in a world where it's normal to do this. Those skills have atrophied. A lot of people in crypto especially think no one likes cold calls, no one responds to that anymore, everything's on Telegram. Let me tell you, it's not true. I have a tech stack that would make most DevOps teams green with envy when it comes to outreach. And yet, over 2/3 of our candidates come from cold calling. And the reason it works is exactly what I was saying about supply and demand mechanics. No one else is doing it. So when you actually call that person, and this even works on, yes, it works on OG engineers that don't have an online presence. If you can somehow get their phone number, they will be very responsive if you do this the right way. And calling also gives you something that no other outreach method does: real-time feedback on if your message is landing and how to adjust it. Now, with this campaign, typically we want to hit 7 to 10 points of contact per person. So if you start with 150 people, that's up to 1,500 touch points. So it's a lot of work. Yeah, it is. Why 7 to 10? Well, you'll be amazed how many people after the 4th voicemail or 5th email or otherwise late point of contact will come back and say, hey, I'm sorry I didn't get back to you before. I am really interested in talking. I've just been busy with A, B, and C. Now, in B2B go-to-market, the meta is definitely moving towards fewer points of contact given the amount of noise out there. But in recruiting, for candidate creation, 7 to 10 is still the sweet spot. But not if they're the generic nonsense messages that other people use. Now, one of the critical aspects of this is not, hey, let's pitch the job across all these different channels. In our outreach, we don't mention anything about the job. Nothing at all. What we want is to get them on a conversation to talk about their career. And when I mentioned earlier that the most dedicated people tend to be the most selfless to a degree, well, sometimes just having that sanctuary where they can sit and talk about what ails them, it's really cathartic for them, and it brings to mind things that they've just been ignoring for so long. So the objective of this candidate creation campaign is to book as many candidate creation calls as possible with our target group. And on those calls, we want to understand the vision, the pain, and the gap. What does that mean? Well, the vision is we want a crystal clear picture of where do they want to go with their life and career? What do they want to accomplish? What are their wildest dreams? What does their future look like that they've envisioned for themselves? And then the pain is we look back to now and we look at, well, are you on the path to achieve that vision? What's stopping you? Is there anything overtly you don't like about your current role? If you could change anything, what would it be? And we then dig to understand the implications of that pain. And sometimes you will get on these calls, people will talk to you, and actually everything will be great and everything is on track. And if that's the case, that's fine. We don't try and twist their arm and shove a square peg into a round hole. We wish them well. Maybe we keep in touch for the future. We're looking for real problems that we have the ability to solve. And so once we've got a clear and thorough picture of this person's vision and how their current situation compares and what's lacking, the question we have to ask is, can we spread the gap? And spreading the gap means if you insert your opportunity that you can offer in the middle of the vision and the pain, can it bridge one to the other? In other words, do we have the solution to their problem, or can we structure our offering, our opportunity in such a way that it can be a solution to that problem? If the answer is no, we don't try and recruit them. We disqualify them. Maybe we add them to the future pipeline and keep in touch in case the situation changes in future. But if we can spread the gap, we already know. This is a cool thing. Before we even tell them anything about the job, or in our situation, this won't apply if you're doing this directly, but in our situation, we tell them nothing about the team, we've told them nothing about the job, we already know that they're going to be interested before we've said anything, because we have such a good understanding of the vision and the pain. That allows us to present them the opportunity in exactly the right terms that are going to be most appealing to them, and of course they're true. And one of the most powerful things about this is, we know they're going to be powerfully interested for the right reasons if we've done this correctly, which means you're insulated from so many of the competitive pressures that exist. If you hire someone who's just taking a job because they need a job or it doesn't quite meet their ideal scenario, they're going to be vulnerable to other headhunters calling. If you do this correctly, you can avoid most of these problems. So you know they're going to be interested. Repeat this sequence until the entire list is contacted 7 to 10 times. We end up with a shortlist of high potential candidates who are all compellingly interested in our opportunity. That is the outcome of phase 2. So then let's talk about phase 3. Phase 3 is mostly about the quality of the hire that you make, but it's also about increasing your percentage odds of actually making the hire. Because you know what? As long as you do it in the right way, having a thorough and rigorous hiring process does not make it more difficult to recruit the right people. It actually increases the interest of the people you want to hire, as long as you do it in an effective way and not, hey, let's have 9 interview rounds over 3 months. Which, by the way, is totally unnecessary if you do this correctly. There does not need to be a conflict between rigor and efficiency and speed. Now, the major step here is the performance-based interview. Again, not a concept I invented. It comes from Lou Adler. I've adapted a little for our methodology, but this ties back to the performance profile that we created back in phase 1. And essentially, the performance-based interview is a structured way of reviewing a person's work history and a series of key accomplishments and projects that they've worked on. And we question them about these handful of projects and accomplishments in exacting detail in order to draw out all the information that we'll then use to evaluate how they can perform in our environment. It's typically a 2 to 3 hour interview, but you can do it in 1 step. And it's relatively simple to execute once a team has been shown to do it. So typically, we would do this in 2 ways. Either we can show you how to use the performance-based interview, and you can do it as a panel with the interviewing team, or we can conduct the performance-based interview for you, and we can provide you with extremely thorough and detailed notes that you can then use for everything else. Now, this session is all about gathering the evidence. Every part of the interview panel will then fill out a scorecard, which ranks each of their accomplishments, and it also ranks what we call the 10 success factors, which include things like their functional competency, their motivation to do the work, which is very different from their motivation to get the job. People often confuse those 2 things. Planning and organizational skills, team management and/or integration, depending on the level of the role, their trend of performance over time, and a few other factors. Now, each individual factor may be more or less important depending on the specific role, but between them, it's going to give you a very holistic overview of this person's abilities and how they're going to adapt to your environment. So once everyone's filled out the scorecard, everyone involved in the hiring process then has to get together and exchange their scorecards. And we might see that everyone's unanimous, in which case, fantastic. If there's a major disagreement, well, you have to convene almost like a jury and argue your points until there's a unanimous agreement on where the scoring is going to be and why. And we're dealing with people, so nothing is going to be 100% accurate. But this is the most objective way possible of creating a factual assessment of their ability. So this already is extremely thorough, much more so than most people do, and less intensive than the typical interview process that tries to achieve this level of rigor. However, we don't go with just one data point. So we have a performance-based interview and its results. We then correlate that with a working interview. Now, working interviews are already quite common in many ways in crypto. People do live coding assessments or take-home assignments. I'm generally not a fan of live coding assessments because, hey, if it's not a requirement of the job for them to figure out some obscure algorithm without looking at Google and under a time pressure, why would you evaluate that ability and use that to judge if they're good enough for the job? The point of the working interview is that it should be, as much as possible, a reflection of what problems they'll actually be required to solve on the job relating to the performance objectives. So that could be, in some cases, a live coding assignment. Probably not. It could be a take-home assignment. If it's a non-technical role, maybe you work with them for a half day and design a scenario that's going to mirror how it's actually going to be like to work on the job. What's important is that whatever the work is going to be and the objectives are, the working interview actually assesses their ability in that area. You might already have something that works perfectly well, or we can work with you to design one that's fit for each requirement. So now we have 2 data points from the performance-based selection process. The third data point is what I like to think of as deep dive references. Now, sometimes people often think references are a waste of time because, of course, why would someone give a reference that's going to say bad things about them? I have had that happen, but it is rare. And some people used to advocate doing what they call backdoor references. Some people still do, where you take references from people that weren't suggested by the candidate. It's effective, but I think it's a minefield for many reasons, so I don't recommend it. What I do recommend doing is deep dive references. So we are taking references from people that the candidate has suggested. We might prompt them even, ask for specific references. I want to talk to your boss from this team, or I want to talk to the person you work with on that, and get their agreement, even if they didn't volunteer that person. But we don't just get a template reference. We get them on the phone, and we do a deep dive with them, and we ask them the tough questions. Yeah, we ask them to elaborate on all the great things. We ask them to talk about specific accomplishments and challenges. And you can use softeners to really work information out of people. So, for example, you might say, well, John, just as there are no perfect companies, there are no perfect people either. What do you think you could have stood to improve? And if you do this the right way, you're going to get honest answers out of people. And you might hear, oh, well, actually, and then you get an extra piece of information there. And it's absolutely worth doing this because 99 times out of 100, the references are going to confirm what you already heard from the other pieces of evidence. But occasionally, you might find out the person's alcoholic, or actually they lied about a major accomplishment of theirs, or some other piece of information like that. It's about mitigating downside risk. If you follow these steps every time, nothing is ever perfect, but you're going to make your accuracy of hiring much, much higher. You're going to know with a 90% plus degree of certainty how this person is going to perform. And you're going to mitigate most of the catastrophic downside risk of hiring someone who isn't who they say they are, because you've done this thoroughly every time. So moving on, the rest of this process is about actually closing a deal. So we want to re-qualify. We want to make sure they're still interested, they still fit the bill, everything is still in order, we're not missing anything. We want to test the offer. So what a lot of people do wrongly is they just, hey, let's come up with an offer and throw it at them and see what happens. The problem is, it's a process of managing expectations. And ideally, we want to be in a position where we can exceed the initial expectation that they have because they're going to be happy. But we also need to play a part in managing that expectation so they don't come in with, unrealistic expectations that we can't possibly meet or that we're bound to disappoint them. Comp has been part of the discussion since very early on in the process. I didn't want to dwell on that for the sake of being clear and explaining how this whole protocol works. But we revisit those expectations and requalification. We test the offer before we make an offer. So we might say something like, we've seen some very strong candidates for this position, but we are very interested in you. We're doing a bit of calibration at the moment. We're thinking of something in a range of X to Y with a token allocation exceeding B. And maybe you float that towards the lower end of what you'd actually consider offering and see how they react. If they say, I'm really interested in the role, I'd be delighted to accept an offer if it comes, and those numbers sound reasonable to me, then you can go back, you can make a better offer than that, and they're going to say yes, and they're going to be happy with it. And the interesting thing is, the more, generally speaking, again, there are always exceptions and degrees, but the better a job you've done at executing this entire process, the more interested they are in working with you specifically, the less demanding their comp expectations are going to be. If you see wildly inflating comp expectations all through the process, a lot of the time, you probably don't want to hire that person anyway, because they're not really interested in you. It doesn't mean they can't do a good job, but you're vulnerable to losing them to the next person who throws lots of money at them. The money needs to be right, and A players will generally cost you more than B and C players. The right ratio is normally something like maybe they cost you 20 to 30% more, but they're multiple times more effective. Not let's throw outlandish amounts of money at people just because it's a bull market. If money is the driving reason why they're interested, the money needs to be right. But if that's the primary motivator, you're usually storing up problems later down the line. So we test the offer, we present the offer, and we call it a bulletproof offer because if you've done this correctly, it's going to be accepted before you make it. If you make an offer that's turned down and go into negotiations, with every no they give you, it makes it less likely that your offer is going to be accepted in future. So as much as possible, we want to make sure they will say yes before we ever make the offer. And there's a choreography to this as well. Maybe this is something you only get with experience, but of course we work with you on this. There's a right time and place to make the offer when they're most ready to receive it. If we make it too early or make it too late, we reduce the good feelings and the chances of acceptance and a successful transition. And finally, we work with you to make sure the exit strategy and transition goes to plan, because the deal isn't done until they walk through the proverbial door on the front day. The first day. So we'll work with the candidate to have a plan for their resignation. We'll work with the hiring team to have a plan for bringing them in. So whatever the period of time between when they accept the offer and when they actually start, sometimes that's just a few days. If you're hiring people in Europe, it could be up to 3 months sometimes. And the longer that period is, the more risk of problems. So we work to have a cadence of contact and specific actions for everyone involved to take to ensure that the landing is as de-risked as possible when they come in with the right mindset and they're excited to get going. And also, we make sure that the onboarding in that first 90 days, it's such a critical period. We make sure that they come in, everything's clear, expectations are set, they're ramped up and eager to go as fast as possible. Worst thing that can happen is when someone comes in and no one knows what's happening for the first day and they just sit there twiddling their thumbs. A lot of hires go wrong, unfortunately, at that point. We make sure that doesn't happen. This then sets you up for runaway success for that hire. So that is a conclusion of phases 1 to 3 of the protocol. Let's talk briefly about phase 4. Phase 4 is simply the process of systematizing this throughout your organization. So everything, of course, starts with one hire. Our clients find that often that the best way to work with us is over a period of, say, 6 to 18 months to embed this in their organization. So we incorporate these processes into the hiring. We transform the interviewing and selection ability of the founding team. We look more strategically at organizational development and turning this from a just-in-time, one-time search process to a strategic elevation process for the organization as a whole that occurs over a period of time. So ideally, there's a knowledge transfer that takes place here. We don't just want to have you dependent on us to make hires. We want to equip you with the ability to do this yourself. And eventually, I know we prefer lean teams, but you might get to a scale where it makes sense you need to hire an internal recruiting team. So if you get to that point, we want to make sure that you hire the right internal recruiting team and you equip them with this knowledge so they can execute these processes for you. So in that sense, phase 4 is really where the magic happens. So that concludes our walkthrough of the Blockchain Recruiter protocol. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it thought-provoking on many levels. I mentioned there was a giveaway. The giveaway is I have a book entitled Hiring for Blockchain, The Unconventional Approach to Hiring Exceptional People in Crypto and Web3. This is a detailed guide to what we've covered in this session, but much more specific. So the first part of the book is all about why the conventional hiring methods don't work anymore. We talk about that transition from the industrial to the information age and the implications of that for hiring and how exactly we can account for that and how we hire now, and some specific things around hiring in crypto that make it uniquely challenging. And the second part of the book is a step-by-step walkthrough of how to execute every part of this process. Now, I'd be delighted to give you a free copy of the book and also a free implementation strategy session where we can talk about some of the biggest levers you can use in implementing this, what you've learned from today's presentation, and from the book. So here's how to take advantage of the giveaway. In the link below this video, you can click on there, pencil in your free strategy session. You will then receive a confirmation email and a calendar invite from me. Now, if you reply to that email, let me know which format you prefer for the book. We have Kindle, we have paperback. If it's paperback, of course, you'll need to send me your address, and I can send it to you as well. I will then send it off to you in whatever format you prefer, and we can discuss further in the strategy session. Thanks so much for being with me today. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to talking with you soon.